Good evening. Welcome to This is Revolution podcast. I am your normal co-host, Pascal Robert, who will be your acting host for the next couple of weeks and few episodes. Our main host, Jason Miles, is on vacation, so I will be the acting host with a variety of guest co-hosts that we will have on the show. I'd like to say welcome to the chat and the audience. If you are new to This is Revolution podcast, please subscribe, hit the bell. Also, if you're interested, become a patron. We'll put up the link for patrons as well. And also share links with your friends, expand our audience. The theme of today's show is going to be the crisis of legitimacy. If you want to understand what exactly caused us to bring up this theme, we realize that between COVID-19, the rise of Trump, the war in Afghanistan and how we withdrew from Afghanistan, and the overall rise of phenomenon like QAnon, Americans in general in the current political moment have been questioning and debating their trust in American political and social institutions, perhaps more than recent history. So what we're going to do today is that we're going to have an episode with two guests to discuss the crisis of legitimacy, and we're going to put it in the context of a book that was written by a leftist philosopher named Habermas in 1973 called The Legitimation Crisis. We're not going to refer too heavily to the book, but we're acknowledging the fact that this concept was broached before at an early period in the crisis in an early period in the 50-year counter-revolution. So before we bring on our guests, we're going to look at the wonderful intro video that was put together by our vacationing host, Jason Miles.
Were these leaders wrong, or were they lying to us about what they were seeing 1 month ago?
I think we've been hearing a consistent message basically since the beginning of the war in Afghanistan, going all the way back to December 2001, when George W. Bush essentially proclaimed that the Taliban had been vanquished and defeated. The same message being that the United States was making great progress in building up the Afghan national security forces, and they would soon be able to stand on their own in defending the government and protecting the country against the Taliban, when we know for certain, not speculatively, but for certain, that inside the government, military leaders and political officials for at least a decade privately were recognizing that what they were assuring the public was true was actually a lie, that the Afghan National Security Forces were a joke. And therefore, the reason it seems shocking to watch the Taliban overrun Afghanistan isn't because we left Afghanistan. Donald Trump wanted to leave Afghanistan too, and wanted to do it quickly, and I supported him in doing so. The reality is the Taliban was always going to take over once we left. The reason it's shocking is because the government, up until 5 weeks ago with Biden and Milley, and going back years, was lying to the public that there was a viable police and military force there that could protect the country when there never was.
Yeah, there obviously was not. Reality has just interrupted that lie. So who are we to trust going?
Because of all we've done, the risk to the American people remains very low. People die from the flu, and this is very unusual. And it is a little bit different, but in some ways it's easier, and in some ways it's a little bit tougher. But we have it so well under control. I mean, view this the same as the flu. When somebody sneezes, I mean, I try and bail out as much as...
All institutions in America post-COVID seem to draw nothing but disdain and distrust from the public. Has America come to a point where belief in these formerly trusted institutions are passe? In the wake of the pandemic and the recent Afghanistan debacle, has the American ruling class lost the capacity to secure the faith of the American people? What does this mean for the contemporary left? We'll ask these questions and more. This is Revolution.
So, supposing we hit the body with a tremendous, whether it's ultraviolet or just very powerful light, and I think you said that hasn't been checked, but you're going to test it. And then I said, supposing you brought the light inside the body, which you can do either through the skin or in some other way. And I think you said you're going to test that too. Sounds interesting. Right, and then I see the disinfectant where it knocks it out in a minute, 1 minute. And is there a way we can do something like that by injection inside or almost a cleaning? Because you see it gets on the lungs and it does a tremendous number of the lungs. So it'd be interesting to check that. So that you're going to have to use medical doctors with. But it sounds interesting to me. So we'll see. But the whole concept of the light, the way it kills it in 1 minute, that's pretty powerful.
There was $600 payments, as you know, in the $900 billion package that passed in December. This is $1,400. Together, that's $2,000.
All right, that was a wonderful intro video by again our host and Capitan, Jason Miles. Also want to remind our viewers and audience in chat, indulge us with a super chat if you so wish. So before we go any further, let me introduce our first co-host. We have the amazing Conan Neutron, who is the host of the long-running music interview podcast, Conan Neutron's Protonic Reversal. He's also a series regular on Movie Night Extravaganza and plays in the rock band Conan Neutron and his Secret Friends, which sometimes features This Is Revolution host Jason Miles in the live band. He wrote for Huffington Post when that actually meant something, and has been active in electoral, activist, and movement politics as a strategist, participant, and community organizer for the last 20 years. Let us give a This Is Revolution welcome to our good friend of the show, Conan Neutron.
You're goddamn right.
There we go, Conan. People are like, where are the applause? Sorry, guys. Jason is the one who is in control of the actual board. I don't have the board.
Yeah, I have to get my soundboard from the basement.
Conan gets around the applause.
Pleasure being here.
I'm glad to be here, Conan. Glad you can be here as well. Let me introduce our second guest. Our second guest is the man, the myth, the legend, the publisher and moderator for the Zero Books website, also a wonderful fictional novelist, the great, the one and only Douglas Lain. Doug Lain in the house.
Hello. I am not just a fictional novelist. I'm also one in real life. But yes.
I'm glad you said it. I was thinking it. Yeah.
Hey, thanks for having me on to This Is Revolution. It's been a while. I think it's been a long while.
Long time, Doug. Thank you very much. For those of you who do not know, our show right now is live streaming on Zero Books, and I believe, hopefully, on Conan Neutron's Facebook page and Twitch, perhaps, aspirationally so. So I'm glad to have both of you guys on the show with this subject matter. So let's get deep into it. What the heck is going on in the world, man? I put a post on Facebook the other day, and I want you guys to indulge me. Now, I know you guys know that, my parentage is of Haitian origin, so I'm sensitive to what's going on there. And my feeling was like, between the Haiti earthquake, the Taliban situation in Afghanistan, and this Delta variant, not to be all metaphysical, but there's like a dark energy in the space, man. The chi is off in the world, what's going on. But then I knew we were coming on to this program, and what really brought this on is I was realizing and looking at the reality of what we were living in. There's a crisis of legitimacy in ways that I've never seen before. Things, of course, we know we have the right-wing version. We have the QAnon version. We get that. We got people who don't trust the COVID, the CDC. There's a whole bunch of COVID conspiracy questions, distrust. The Afghanistan withdrawal causes another crisis of legitimacy in terms of people's mind. You got a whole range of people who believe that the 2020 election was fake. I understand a lot of this discourse is coming from the reactionary right, but even liberals somewhat are kind of questioning the efficacy of the Biden administration, definitely with Afghanistan. Is Biden mentally all there? Why is Kamala Harris the VP? And I would argue that we can say that this contemporary version of crisis of legitimacy. Perhaps it starts with the war on terror and 9/11. But I think that within the continuum of the 50-year counter-revolution, we can go back to Watergate as kind of the watershed moment in which Americans start to truly not believe the overall story. Maybe we want to go back to the Kennedy assassination. I'll leave it to you guys. But I would like you guys to, number one, put this crisis of legitimacy in the current moment in context, primarily for our audience. And then secondly, what is an adequate left response to these crises of legitimacy, if you will? We're going to start with Conan. You want to jump off? Then I'll move to you, Doug.
Okay. Sure. So that's the question of our age right now, right? I mean, it's all pervasive. I do agree that there's a miasma almost surrounding almost everything. It's important to note that this didn't come out of nowhere. You know, you used the phrase that I mentioned earlier, which is it's used a lot of times in engineering and technology, but it's not a bug, it's a feature. And I think it's important to note that, and certainly I'm not the first person to come up with that particular usage and theory, but if you look back pretty much since about the time period you're talking about, again, Gore Vidal, Pascal, you and I are both fans of the man. He mentioned a lot of writings about Banksman Carter and Banksman Ford and so on, that no matter the party affiliation, they were serving the needs of capital and explicitly doing so. And if any, it's just become like slightly more masked off than it was before. I'm not going to say that it wasn't always going on, but they figured out a way to perfect it. And one of the ways to perfect it is to not just explicitly attack institutions that protect the working class and the plebes, the proles, if you will, but to sabotage them and sabotage faith in it. And that's, everyone likes focusing on Grover Norquist and drowning government in a bathtub and whatnot. And that's the big, oh, let's raise a bunch of money kind of line that you can put on it. But the fact of the matter is, it's a lot easier just to not staff the agencies at all and say, look at what a terrible job they're doing. Obviously, government doesn't work. Obviously, this is a problem. Let's give all the money to corporations instead. It'll be better if it's privatized. Again, it's not a bug, it's a feature.
That's interesting. So Conan is positing a very, very interesting kind of response to the conundrum, in that maybe these crises are not accidental, but part of the neoliberal project in delegitimizing the functioning of the state and replacing it with private actors and private function and private institutions. But my retort to that, not that I disagree with you, Conan, is that why isn't it that part of the delegitimization process is applied to private corporation and private actors as well? So let's move to Doug, because we got some super chats already. Doug, I'd like you to put in your thoughts here.
Well, I agree in a sense that the crisis of legitimacy isn't a bug but a feature, but I would doubt that it's a consciously designed feature of our current moment. I don't see the neoliberal project as having arisen primarily as a conspiracy of capitalist elites to put down the working class, but rather as sort of a makeshift management strategy that was put together and adopted in response to the economic crisis of the 70s. And it's important. This is something I go over and over again. It's like a little bit of knowledge that I've gained in the last year or so. So I say it a lot, but it's important to remember that after World War II, most of the Frankfurt School philosophers, most of the left, and certainly quite a bit of the capitalist class believed that capitalism and the contradictions of capitalism and the economic crises that it engendered had been overcome by a managerial strategy that you could see in the West with the expansion of the welfare state in various forms, and in the East with the advent of the Soviet project, and that even people like Marcuse and Adorno believed that we weren't going to be looking forward to the kind of crises within capitalism that would lead to working class struggle. That was wrong in a sense, because we did have economic crises and we did have struggle, But what we lost in the process was a confidence in the party and in a socialist project. Certainly by the late 60s and 70s and the rise of the New Left, the idea that we could create new institutions of power that could replace capitalism was sort of doubted. And we went from party politics to movement politics. We went from struggles for new forms of self-government and also new forms of economic relations to struggles around expression and inclusion and participation and eventually resistance. So I would say that, the first crisis in legitimacy might have been the crisis in Marxism, the crisis in the struggle for socialism. And now we have a political life which doesn't have a horizon, which is only really functioning in a permanent crisis mode. And so it's not a surprise then that people don't have confidence in it, although we should probably be a little bit nuanced about it. Like, what do we really believe? Do we really doubt the efficacy of the state? Or do we say we doubt the efficacy of the state, but act as if we still rely on it? So I think it's a complicated issue, but the main thing we've lost confidence in is our own ability to create radical change through seizing power by creating new institutions of power and a new kind of politics.
Doug, you posit a very, very interesting response in that the crisis of legitimacy does not come from the left or right flank of capitalism, but the crisis of legitimacy comes from basically the surrender of the left in its ability to posit a response to capitalist realism. In other words, what you're saying is that the crisis of legitimacy pretty much starts with the failure of the old left to be able to deal with the rising technocracy that comes about after the World War II moment, where you have things like the Frankfurt School, which I would argue, and correct me if I'm wrong, is a response in belief that capitalism has kind of won and is permanent. And how do we deal with that? Looking for sectors of society that will be revolutionary. That's an interesting thought that I haven't really considered, that really the crisis of legitimacy is a product of the failure of the left, not as a product of the actual failure of the ruling class, if you will. That's a very interesting, that's a provocative way of posting. Conan, what do you think about that? I'd like to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that all you have to do is look at, what's the Green Party's foreign policy? Well, don't wage war. Okay, well, what about when you're already in war? I agree with that. I agree. Let's not wage war. But the part of the reasons why Jill Stein ended up being a punchline in the 2016 election is that her and Gary Johnson were given a platform they were never given before because of all these new media outlets, and neither one of them really brought the damage. They were ready with their prepared lines. They were ready for where they're strong at, but they weren't ready to articulate a different kind of foreign policy. They weren't ready. Honestly, I hate to use the overused term, but they weren't ready for prime time. And that's a failure. We're predominantly concerned. Obviously, this is not a crossfire. We're primarily concerned with the left on this show, but I think it's systemic in the fact that you have a lot of third-party mindsets and people that are not affiliated at all, that once you have to actually be in the soup and be involved with everything, some of them are half-baked opinions or half-formed opinions. And when I say half-baked, I don't mean thought out. I mean that you're not prepared to articulate your opinion and debate it and say, no, this is why. Here's, for instance, healthcare, right? You say that the Medicare for all is too expensive. I say we're paying for it now. We already are paying for it. There's so much graft and waste in healthcare right now that's happening that is hurting the bottom line of everybody, again, using capitalist language. But by the same token, justify that, not how we're going to pay for it, which is the most ingenuous frame ever. And a lot of us do with frame language. And we're still way too obsessed with catharsis over getting results. Meaning, I agree, yeah, defund the police, and that's a great thing to shout, right? But guess what? If you use the terms police reform, you might actually see some action from it.
This, that's definitely interesting. I got to take this super chat. How does the left build a movement in this era and make sure Pascal and Jason get their juice boxes? Don't worry about our juice boxes. We do several shows about building a left. How about we start talking to working class people where they are and ask them what they want in terms of their policy solutions and organizing them instead of all of us, myself and Jason included, being just internet chatterboxes and actually going out and talking to working class people where they are. That might be a good actual step for the left as well. So let's actually stay on this subject that the crisis of legitimacy is really a product of the failure of the left. Should we view the crisis of legitimacy, though, as a moment for radicalization or a radicalizing moment? In other words, as people who are on the left, should we be, melancholy that people are distrusting all of these institutions? And why does it seem that all of the anti-status quo or the countervailing energy, all the challenging the normative party line, if you will, is on the reactionary right, while the left, or the putative left, if you will, what people call the left, I argue that we don't have a left, we just have leftists, is worried about coalescing or how we coalesce or work with or deal with or don't deal with the Democratic Party. Don't we find it rather kind of ironic that all of the quote-unquote radical energy that we're seeing is on the reactionary right, while the left is somewhat circle-jerking about what we can and can't get from the Democrats? I know Doug probably has some strong opinions about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, to start with, let's think about Afghanistan for a moment and the response to the failure of the occupation of Afghanistan. I recall being involved I was involved in the protests against Afghanistan, the invasion of Afghanistan in 2002 for an organization called the Portland Peaceful Response Coalition. And at that time, when, right after the attacks on the World Trade Center, the people who were part of the kind of established, or the remnants of the established New Left that were still around, formed a coalition, and the first thing that they passed was the promise not to be a political organization, that they would call for peace without taking political positions, which made the organization in its earliest days an organization which only would push a sentiment rather than a platform or a position or any kind of plan. So you can look at the rest of the peace movement around that time, organizations like Not in Our Name. And again, there was a failure to be anything but a negative response to the invasions that were coming. No effort made to form a political organization that could offer other responses to the problem of terrorism at the time. So the crisis of legitimacy, certainly at that moment, there wasn't a crisis of legitimacy for the US government. Most people were supporting the Bush administration in that moment. And in fact, it was thought of as a way to kind of overcome the Vietnam syndrome and the reluctance of the American public to go to war. But for people who are on the left, we could all see that it was an illegitimate response. Some of the things that are being repeated today, as if it was an established fact that everyone knew, but really what the truth of it is, like, it was established fact that was suppressed. Things like the fact that the Taliban offered to turn over Osama bin Laden before the invasion began. Not only did they offer to turn him over, but they offered to turn him over to like anyone the United States named. Their conditions kept dropping, about extradition. So that didn't get to be widely known at the time, but it was a fact then. Now it's kind of established fact in retrospect. And it seems like nobody wants to claim how much love and support they had for that invasion at the time. But the real abdication, I think, from the peace movement and the people who were part of a radical left or thought of themselves that way, was the abdicating the responsibility to form a political response, to have an alternative platform, to say what a better response to the attacks of September 11th would have been. And on that level, I mean, it wouldn't have been that difficult. It wouldn't have been like, oh, we have a better response to the problems of capitalism, but just like a better foreign policy. Like a sane response to the attacks of September 11th would have been to try to stabilize the Middle East and bring the criminals responsible for the attacks of 9/11 to justice. But that was off the table. And it was not just off the table for the established centrist parties, but it was also off the table for the left when they abdicated their responsibility to be political.
Yeah, if I may add to that, I first of all, I think that's a great point, and I think it's also interesting that at the time, the idea of there being like a bipartisan or a nonpartisan anti-war movement is absurd now. But I think the idea, a lot of it was like, oh, well, there's people that maybe they don't agree about freeing Mumia, but they're here against the war. And I was in those, the protests for this, and what I was seeing is the same old song and dance, man, which is just, you have people that are there for, hey, we don't want to be bombing these people that didn't cause this, right? We don't want to go to war against these people, but then everyone just trots out their normal axes to grind about everything. And it became very clear, and that was sort of like the naive baby version of what we have now, with like a hyper partisan, that it's identity. It's actually people's identity is, no, screw those people, they suck. But at the time, I think one of the ideas was, well, no, if everyone's presented with the facts, they will clearly see that our argument is best, and we will all be able to move towards an end goal for that. Whereas what they weren't understanding was that framed language was going to become the new normal.
Interesting. I want to ask you guys about a theory that is often posited by folks on the putative left, if you will. Chris Hedges talks about this: the end of empire, the fall of empire, the last stages of American empire on decline. What are your thoughts on this kind of discourse? Do you think it's kind of hyperbolic? Do you think it's true? Do you think that it's kind of typical left posturing? What are we to make of this kind of theory, that what we're seeing with these crises of legitimacy are demonstrations or proof or evidence that American empire is not only in decline, but it's pretty much on its deathbed? I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. You want to start? Let's start with Doug.
Okay.
Actually, start with Conan. We started with Doug before. Conan, let's go. You go first.
I'll make it real simple. Public Enemy. Don't believe the hype.
Yeah. I think that it's true enough that the balance of power that defined the world since World War II has shifted, and that there's more an equal distribution of might economically, certainly, but also possibly soon enough militarily around the globe, and that while the American empire's influence is hardly over, that we can see that I think there's some problems with it. I think that China is, like in the 80s, there was a lot of talk about the threat from Japan, which was always overblown, and it was just an excuse for certain kinds of nationalism and neoliberal policies and so forth. But I think today we really can see that the balance of power is shifting, and the United States is not going to be able to play quite the same dominant role. I think we may be still called upon to be the policeman of the world for a variety of reasons for a while yet. But what is Christopher Hedges really talking about? Is he talking about the corruption of the American empire, the corruption of the elites? Because one of the reasons you asked something earlier, Pascal, which was why is it that the right is having so much traction in this moment when the state seems illegitimate in response to COVID. And the reason why might be also because the idea that the primary problem in the US or around the world is corruption is a right-wing perspective. It's at least a conservative one. It's saying, well, the system as we have it now could function if it weren't for power imbalances, corrupt actors, bad apples, and so on. And if we could stamp out the corruption in government, whether it's through campaign finance reform or making sure that the criminal justice system treats all of us equally, and goes after people like Chris Cuomo, or make sure that Trump pays for his crimes. All these kinds of approaches to handling the crisis that comes from the way power functions in society misses the fact that when power is functioning well, corruption will always follow, and inequity will always follow, and crimes will always follow, and wars will always follow. That the wars of the world are not a bug but a feature, as Conan said earlier about the illegitimacy crisis.
Well, and I think.
Go ahead, Conan. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, and obviously corruption is used often to undermine governments that are in power that people just want to see overthrown. So you start alleging corruption, especially in South America. I don't know if you guys have ever read the Confessions of an Economic Hitman, that book. But I mean, gosh, like that, the kind of stuff like that in our name, it's like a lot of these whisper campaigns and things along those lines. And something else that I want to hit on too is that there's a certain degree that I think people are beginning to understand it now, that there's money in the fight, but not necessarily the victory. What do I mean by that? Okay, so let's look at the anti-choice crowd, right? They want to campaign against abortion. They want to make big money raising money from all the true believers that don't want there to be abortions. They don't actually care about the result. The result's irrelevant. It's the actions of getting there. Now, you can apply this to American foreign policy, wealth extraction for Afghanistan, be it opium fields. You can talk about it for Iraq for the oil. Like, people are making big money. And when I say about the American empire in decline, I'm talking about as a government. Now, American corporate power has never been stronger. And I say American corporate power because it's ostensibly American, but we really created these, and I hesitate to use the term, but global corporate powers that have an oligarchical control over so many aspects of everything, that when you talk to like the more cynical amongst us about like, oh, well, there's no difference between the parties. It's just, two people with puppets, both on either side. To a certain degree, again, going back to Gore Vidal and talking about Banksman and things along those lines. These aren't new ideas. This has been happening for a while. But what they've done is they've gotten their act together in such a way, and they've finally honed their dark martial arts, that it's all pervasive to the point that it looks hopeless from the outside. This is the way that has always been. This is the way it will always be. It's the one part of 1984 that's somewhat correct, that, we've always been at war with Eurasia. We've always been at war with Oceania, bit of it. And it, again, comes back to frame language, because really it was closer to Brave New World in a lot of ways to where our culture is now, where we have Soma, we have the opiate of the masses, et cetera, et cetera. But the thing that is held true is just, if you throw up enough dust at any given moment in time, it doesn't mean that you necessarily need to win. You just need the other guy to lose. And if you throw up enough dust, that's going to be how you do that.
What's also fascinating, right, about this whole crisis of legitimacy discourse that we're positing ourselves is that if we look at the period of time where the liberal democratic order was most effective, i.e. post-World War II, 40s, 50s, and so on and so forth, even though there might not have been a crisis of legitimacy and institutions of the ruling class were, quote-unquote, maximizing in their efficacy, they were still doing horribly, horribly oppressive and damaging stuff all over the world. The Dulles brothers and their foreign policy. You have what happened in Iran. You have what happened in Latin America. So, I mean, I guess there's a very part of us, even though we're talking about there's a crisis of legitimacy, in that discourse in and of itself, it assumes that when the ruling class had its most effective ability in managing the affairs of society, those were somehow halcyon days. when in reality, for large segments of American society, America was still pretty much, crappy. I don't think any of us would want to be black in the South in 1952, or a woman, anywhere in the country as well, having to deal with the sexism or a variety of other oppressions. So are we kind of, when we posit this theory of crisis of legitimacy, are we romanticizing something that doesn't even merit romanticization, perhaps? And maybe that's my fault for even positing the question in that way. I'd like to hear your thoughts. Let's start with Doug.
Yeah, I think that we may very well be romanticizing the kinds of institutional power that was present in the past. One of the things, though, that one of the commenters said early on in our chat was that the crisis in democracy and the crisis in legitimacy arose in the discourse around the same time in the 70s, that these were both ideas that were being kicked around in elite circles. And the crisis in democracy was, of course, the crisis of too much democracy. So one of the things that can happen to, elite powers as the people who are counted as citizens who have some say in government expands, their legitimacy declines. So, what constitutes legitimacy is kind of an open question, I guess. It depends on who's being served by the state power. The thing I want to go back to, though, just to kind of contradict myself a little bit here or to complicate this, is that along the difficulty is when all the institutional powers and the structures of society that we do have to rely on to survive, like for instance now in the time of COVID, have no legitimacy. The mistrust can run deep enough that it even applies to the people themselves, that we lose confidence not only in our institutions and our elites and our politicians, but in one another, and in our ability to organize to make a change. And I definitely see that. I'm going to be personal for a moment. I've been dating for the first time in a long time. I'm talking to a lot of women, white women of a certain age, and
condolations, by the way. Condolations, which is condolences plus congratulations.
Yeah. So what I find is that they're even the most, sympathetic characters who I go out on a date with once or twice will talk about the ignorant masses, whether they locate them in the South or down the street, depends maybe on their economic position. If they're in working class neighborhoods, they locate them down the street. And if they are in an upper class little suburb, they locate them in the geographic South or in the rural areas. But the point is, we liberals, or I shouldn't say we liberals, but liberals are very, there's a crisis of legitimacy of the neighbor at the moment. There's we get a lot of pleasure out of thinking the other guy's stupid, and in blaming each other for the problems that are arising with COVID. And I guess it's easier than taking a good look at the fact that the vaccine isn't working as well as we were told it would, and the level of vaccination is far lower than it ought to be. And if you want to go all the way back a year, the testing and tracking was a complete failure, and the politicization of the problem was also a complete political failure and a failure of the healthcare, the official health community, the CDC and the World Health Organization. I mean, we're still dealing with the fact that it's possible, seemed of the choices, the more probable fact is that this was a man-made virus, or, not on purpose necessarily, but it was leaked from a lab. And we were told the opposite for a long time. If we could constrain who we think is illegitimate and have more faith in one another, I mean, I feel like, why can't we all get along is what I'm saying. But if we could try to contain the crisis of illegitimacy to the state and really to the corporations that are running our healthcare industry, I think that would be a positive step in the right direction.
Well, that's another interesting addition you put into the mix here, Doug, is that the crisis of legitimacy in our institution, public or private, is now spilled over so bad that it's affecting our belief in the legitimacy of other citizens, our neighbors, our friends, depending on either their beliefs, thoughts, ideas, worldviews, and so on and so forth. So how does that give us an ability to even function as a society when politics has made us unable to trust each other? Conan, you have any thoughts on that?
Well, sure. I mean, the kind of the reductive like laugh line is sort of like, whose legitimacy, whose freedom, like who is this benefiting? And I think when you so mistrust, I think anytime you're dealing with a class-based system and you're dealing with keeping people at each other's throats rather than banding together to be like, hey, wait a second, these guys are the ones that are causing all these problems, then you're going to be able to keep them in line. And I agree that like we got to be real careful about, the masses or whatever and things along those lines. I don't think people are inherently evil. I also don't think they're inherently smart. There's a lot of dummies out there, right? And that's something that I think leftists especially can kind of fall into a habit of doing, which is to give unearned credit to people just because they're working class. Also, good time to mention that whenever people talk about working
class. Yep. Did we lose? Did the deep state get Conan?
I think so. In solidarity, Pascal, I think you and I should hold perfectly still and throw our voices for the remainder of this.
So we should become ventriloquists of This Is Revolution.
Yeah, because he was not moving at all. He hasn't moved in a while, and so I feel like in solidarity with him, we should remain still. I don't know if I can do it though. Oh,
did we get him back? I don't know if we got him.
We'll see if we can get him back, but I'll let you guide me here, Pascal.
No problem. Well, let's continue. So, I mean, Conan's position is that, even though there may be a class component in the way in which we view people who are considered to be, the unknowing who are buying into various quote unquote COVID conspiracies, that we shouldn't necessarily impute credibility on them just because they're the proletariat and the working class, which is kind of interesting from a kind of Marxian, or as Adolf Fried would say, Marxoid perspective, that, just because someone is part of the proletariat doesn't mean that his opinions about anything should be any more valid or taken any more seriously. Do you think that Conan's position is somewhat elitist, off the mark, or what are your thoughts about that as a good student of Marxist philosophy?
Well, I just remember something that Amber Ali Frost, who's one of the Chapo people, told me once in an interview years ago, which is that just because you get hit by a car doesn't mean you know how the combustion engine works. I would agree that you don't just take someone's opinions for granted because of their position, whether or not they're exploited in economically or they're the victims of racism or sexism. But again, to go to the question of legitimacy, we need to develop. I mean, this is one of the reasons why Ben Burgess's book was important about give them an argument. It was like, we need to have a way to recognize what is a legitimate argument that isn't just about who's speaking, and have faith in one another's ability to reason it out. I mean, there does have to be kind of a leap of faith at some point or another that even if presented with 2 + 2 = 4, you can rely on the fact that your brain's working well enough to see that is true, right? And not have an endless questioning after, like epistemic certainty or something like that. We do need to be able to have a kind of a workaday, rational approach to our politics, and we need to think that one another are legit. In other words, give people the benefit of the doubt that they're capable of acting in good faith and thinking things through, and create a climate where that's encouraged. All this is easier said than done. And at the moment, so much of our communication is going on through, I mean, this is something I'm talking about all the time, going on through parasocial relationships and kind of alienated conversations. And we're all set apart from each other in competition, especially in like the left media space. So it's very difficult to overcome the kind of assumption of bad faith on the other person's part, especially if you're not part of the same clique, But yeah, we need to think that one another is legitimate and give people the benefit of the doubt and demand reason at the same time.
Well, you're positing some interesting questions here, Doug, in terms of how we actually become good human beings in a time in which the social environment and political environment of the current era are making people basically distrust each other over politics, over policy, over worldviews, and a variety of other things. And we definitely can't, this is one of the things that we can't blame on Trump, right? This started before Trump. Of course, we may argue that the phenomenon of Trumpism helped metastasize this reality. But the question becomes, right, for us who consider ourselves on the left, how do we negotiate ourselves out of this? How do we create a quote unquote left political project that actually addresses these problems? I mean, are we just saying, well, it's time for revolution and that's it? Is reform possible? Should we abandon the capacity of asking or demanding reform? What do you see as the way out in this paradigm for those of us who are framing the current problems from a materialist lens of a crisis, a problem of eminently coming from capitalism?
From my perspective as someone who publishes books, who writes, who creates YouTube channels and creates podcasts, there are just some choices that you have to try to make and realize that you're going to be pushed to move against those choices. That recognizing how you're compromised is the first step. Recognizing that, for instance, on our YouTube channel, there's a drive to do kind of ambulance chasing and to follow kind of frivolous trends on Twitter and to chase for attention in a way that doesn't really help develop ideas and understanding that much, and not expect perfection. We do that. We have to get clicks, but on the other hand, try to recognize what the effects of that would be on your content and work against it as best you can. In terms of between content creators like you and me, we have to recognize that we're put in competition with each other, even as we can mutually support one another and work to mutually support one another and not get too hung up on the kind of structural fact of competition for Patreon dollars or something like that. But then you go beyond us, right? Beyond our particular space. I do wonder sometimes if there are any left organizations that aren't just media personalities now, or if they're, I know there are, but then you have to, if you're getting involved in an organization, let's say a Marxist sectarian group or some sort of nonprofit lobbyist organization, you have to work for transparency again and self-reflection. But it gets harder and harder. And I do think we need to think about a kind of organization like a party that would seek political power to make radical changes, and that the creation of that party would demand certain kinds of sacrifices from its members. It would be a project that would be bigger than any of the careers of the individuals. It would be bigger than even the short-term gains of some small communities. It would have to demand a kind of a leap of faith and short-term sacrifices to create.
We got Conan back. So
Guess
Conan, we
who's
were
back?
basically asking
Back
Doug.
again.
There we go. We were asking.
Are you
Doug,
frozen again, Conan? No, you're moving. All right, you're moving.
No,
I'm
good.
very pleased. Did you
So,
change your
Conan,
jacket? Did you change?
I'm just
your jacket?
disciplined.
Oh, good. Good.
Yeah,
good.
yeah. I was waiting for the computer to boot, and someone said if he comes back with a costume change, I'm going to freak out or something. I was like, hey, that's not a bad idea, because I have to wait for it to reboot. It's a total hardware crap.
That's great. That's awesome.
So Conan, let me hear your thoughts. What do you think should be the left's response to the current moment? Are we a moment where you just throw up the hands and say, hey, listen, revolution. The system can't be reformed. Nothing can be done. It's a wrap. Can we organize towards reform? What exactly does a quote unquote left or progressive politics look like at a time when there is a universal crisis of legitimacy in which people are not believing in our institutions, people are not believing in our government's functionality? What exactly does that politics look like, and how do we organize it? Conan?
Well, I'm gonna use the line that I used earlier when we were talking about Habermas, to say, the show isn't called This Is Regulation, right? But
There you go.
I think when it comes down to it is that you need to look at it like, hey, is this a state of despair? Is this a state of opportunity? I didn't walk into this expecting to talk about Gore Vidal as much, but he was the first one I saw to bring up the idea of a constitutional convention. And again, this is back in the 70s, right? To do a new constitutional convention and to say that, like, you know, of which the critical thinking against that is, well, yeah, but we might lose some of the rights we have. And it's like, yes, but you might gain ones that you don't have. And the only other person I've really seen advance this idea is Larry Lessig, who I think is actually a very underrated thinker in these sorts of matters. And I've come around more to that, I think, in the past few years, in the same way that I think that we've seen social aspects of culture move forward almost on an exponential level, whereas the outfits of politics and how we think about politics wholesale hasn't really changed that much, except for bottom-up campaigning, which really started all the way back like that to Howard Dean. Whatever he did with it afterwards, the Obama campaign did a very good job with it. Bernie Sanders took it to like a new level, et cetera, et cetera. But thinking about just only working with the existing superstructure, there is opportunities for change. The problem is it's not sexy. When people think of revolution, you know, they're thinking of like, yeah, let's you know, get our guns, go on the streets and this and that. And no, that's not the kind of revolution that we actually need. That revolution we actually need is a government that serves the people, that serves the interests of the people rather than corporations. Okay, so maybe you go back to campaign finance reform. Well, campaign finance reform isn't sexy. Nobody wants to talk about campaign finance reform. Well, you have to worry less about what is and isn't going to play and just do it. Just do it. That's the thing that like the right is so, they're so good at. I'm envious of it. They don't care about like, oh, is some lefty podcast gonna call me a nerd? No, they don't give a damn. They have a whole well-funded superstructure in place to advance their ideas. The whole reason we even know the Overton windows because of the Mackinac Institute. They fund places that literally just come up with ideas. Think tanks. What do we have? This. And no offense to this, but
yeah, I'm telling you. But could you do that voice again one more time, Conan? So who?
No, they're gonna be mean to me. Yeah, exactly.
Well, I actually don't want to think that we don't just have this. What we do have is the foundation world infrastructure that promotes the notion that we have left institutions, which are actually capitalist finance institutions, promoting neoliberal reforms under the charade of seeming left. So we have worse than this. We actually have left flank of capital institutions that are socially engineering the facade of movements under the guise of quote unquote being progressive that are actually doing nothing but promoting a kind of neoliberalism in wokeness, if you will.
Greenwashing is a good example, right? Like it's cool to like be for the environment, but like not actually do anything about it. Like all you gotta do is put the right press release, right? Everybody's like putting their rainbow flags up during Pride Month, but like still like are using the same abhorrent hiring practices that they've always used. And then when they have labor, exploiting them. Let's talk about H-1B1s. Why are H-1B1s bipartisan? Because it's basically conscripted labor. You usually have young men from India coming to do a job, supporting their entire family, single-handedly elevating them from a case system that had them like below poverty up to a middle class. And then they get to tell them, you will do whatever I say, whenever I say it. And if you do not, you will be sent the fuck home. Pardon my French. But like why are those bipartisan? Why do you think? Why do you think they're bipartisan? It's a great way to exploit people.
Well, we're coming up on the last 5 minutes, and if we can, we're going to try to get at least a half hour, maybe more, out of both of you in the patrons only section, so we can move this on. And I think that when we do move on, we're going to take a play on something that Doug kind of started to discuss. What is the role, condition, and the state of left online media in this current moment? And, are we basically coming to a position where the left online media has been reduced to nothing but a circular firing squad pretty much from the sheer travesty. Now, as you guys probably know, we pride ourselves here at This is Revolution podcast as being non-sectarian leftists. I think you guys know what that is. And we also pride ourselves in not getting into left gossip or picking sides of who's there. So when we do engage in this conversation in our patrons only section, let's keep it broad, generalized. We don't have to necessarily get into names because this is across the board. It's a phenomenon we're seeing everywhere with people who are on left media. This kind of internecine war and battle we're seeing, and I think that we all agree that it's a rather tragic illustration how even a bunch of YouTube and social media personalities on the left become so sucked into just petty, childish high school bickering that it's really delegitimizing the overall project of what is supposed to be about making life better for the majority of Americans who are working class and many of whom are poor. So we're definitely going to get into that in the next hour. Before we go, any of you have anything you want to promote that you're working on, projects, books, appearances? I'll give you the last 3 minutes to do so, if you will. Let's start with Conan.
Goes first?
Conan, go ahead.
Okay, so Conan Neutron's Protonic Reversal. It's all music interviews. That's all free all the time. ProtonicReversal.com. Anywhere you find podcasts. I never ever remember to pimp the YouTube. So yeah, like and subscribe to that if you're a music person. Conan Neutron and the Secret Friends is my band, and we are on all the normal places you would get music. Bandcamp gets us the most money to keep the wheels grinding. I've become a series regular on Forrest's Movie Night Extravaganza. So if you're into movies, it's the best movie podcast out there. Granted, I'm a little bit biased, but like and subscribe to that. It's a really new show. I think it's only been around 6 weeks or so, but really amazing content. And yeah, it's always a pleasure. This is my favorite show. So it's always a pleasure to be on. If you did call it This Is Regulation, you probably get some of that, big Soros money. Maybe not. I don't know. But
but you wouldn't have anybody watching. So
yeah. Well, the trade-off is nobody would give a damn.
Right. Well, I should say that people should go to the Zero Books YouTube channel and subscribe. Some people are watching that here right now. I want to mention that we have a book coming out from Are You Serious called The Freaks and the Machine, which is about cyberpunk, a cyberpunk magazine called Mondo 2000 that was around in the 90s and 80s.
I remember that.
Yeah, totally, so it's like the story. Yeah, the story of that and what went wrong with cyberpunk, and what went right with cyberpunk too, I guess. But and I'm excited about that book, and I'm going to be we're definitely going to make, but I'm not sure when it's going to come out, like a documentary video film to promote that. And I've got a whole bunch of old footage about cyberpunk from the 80s and 90s that I'm going to be, using. So that's something that's fun that will be coming. If you are interested in anarchism, we have a book coming out by Michael Albert about Paracon called No Bosses. If you're a Chapo fan and you want to help the imprint, you should tell Matt Christman that he needs to get writing, because he has a book due to us called Behold a Fell Horse, which we're really hoping he'll deliver. And that's something that is exciting that's coming up. And if you want to read my work, there's a book that came out in 2018 called Bash Revolution. And when you buy a copy, I get royalty checks, like $1 or something. So go buy a copy of that. And that's everything.
Well, all right. We have officially come on an hour. Gentlemen, I would like to thank you, the Zero Books family, for also watching our program. We're streaming on their page right now. Conan, I want to thank you and appreciate you for coming on and having this conversation. I think this is a pretty good show, and we will be sending you the link so that we will see you in the patrons only section. We'll try to get a little bit more than a half hour, at least that long, and we'll continue this conversation on what exactly is the state of left media in this moment as well, in this crisis of legitimacy. And on that note, we will wrap it up, and we will be leaving you with our outro. And I can say that we are out.
Peace.